And welcome to today's Human Rights Centre seminar. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Cheryl Lawther and I'm the current director of the Human Rights Centre at Queen's. It's my pleasure to invite to welcome Dr. James Gallen to speak with us today. James is a lecturer in the School of Law and Government in Dublin City University, and his research interests include human rights, international law, and transitional justice. And what is particularly timely and also of significant interest to our seminar today is that a very large portion of James's current research portfolio concentrates on transitional justice and a transitional justice approach to historical abuse in consolidated democracies. And James has particular expertise in relation to the legacy of child sexual abuse within the Roman Catholic Church in the Republic of Ireland. And I think it's worth mentioning that in recognition of James's expertise in this area, in 2017, he was appointed as an expert advisor on transitional justice by the Department of Children and Youth Affairs to advise on a transitional justice approach to the issue of the mother and baby homes in the Republic of Ireland. And James has also published very widely on this area, which you might like to follow up with after this seminar today. And his work appears in some of the top socio-legal journals, such as the International Journal of Transitional Justice, the Modern Law Review, the International Journal of Law in Context, and Human Rights Law Review. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome James to our seminar series today for what I hope will be not only an extremely interesting seminar, but one that is also extremely timely as well. Just before I hand over to James, can I just remind you of some basic housekeeping principles? So if I could ask you to keep your microphones muted and your cameras off, please. That just helps with the continuity of the recording and a seamless seminar. We'll have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. Of course, if you have any questions as you go along, feel free to pop them into the chat box. But otherwise, at the end, you can either use the raise your hand function or the chat box, and I will do my best to moderate those questions and pass them James's way. So for now, it's over to James, and I will let James kick things off. Thank you. Oh, James, I think you might be muted. No, I still can't hear you. No joy.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's you now.
Thank the Lord. That would have been very awkward, wouldn't it?
Extremely difficult. All right, let's not touch any buttons.
Using charades, I don't think we'd get very far. So
yeah, I'm afraid my understanding of hand signals on academic topics or in general is not good.
Well, look, sorry for that snafu as we start off. Thanks so much for the introduction, Cheryl. And thanks to everyone for being here. I might start off by just sharing my screen. Hopefully that'll go a bit easier, and we can begin in earnest with the content. So what I'd love to do today is to talk about transitional justice and how it might be changed or impacted by the potential expansion to looking at questions of historical abuse in the context of church and state. So what I'd love to do is position this expansion within existing trends in transitional justice literature and look at the relationship that transitional justice has with the growing field of transformative justice and see how those two trends intersect in the application to historical abuse in consolidated democracies. And my argument today focuses on the potential for transitional justice to shift in its understanding of transition itself and of the question of progress and theory of change that's behind a transitional justice, by expanding to look at historical abuses in consolidated democracies. And in particular, I think that's evident by the need for transitional justice in responding to historical abuse to address questions of structural injustice, and in particular to do so through the dimensions of power and emotion. And so my concluding today will be asking about the nature of transition and what that means in the context of peaceful consolidated democracies. So the overall thesis that I'm looking to develop at present in a monograph looks at the question of what's an adequate response to historical generational abuse that may be constitutive or foundational to Western states or indeed to Christian churches as well. And my argument is to suggest that while those states and churches would benefit from drawing from the paradigmatic functions and goals of transitional justice, truth commissions, accountability, redress, and so on, it's also necessary and incumbent upon those states and churches to expand their understanding of how to address their past by looking at historical structural injustice, and in particular by evaluating the dimensions of power and emotions and public emotions in responding to longer form injustice. So as I said, in the literature, you'll find two trends in transitional justice thinking at present, or at least two trends. You'll find TJ being expanded to new contexts outside of post-conflict or post-authoritarian settings, applications to ongoing situations of conflict in Northern Ireland very significantly, and also in Colombia. But now looking at, in recent years, its application to non-armed conflict or non-dictatorship settings. And I've written proposing the idea of TJ being of some value to child abuse in the Catholic Church and indeed to Ireland. So that's one trend in the literature that we see mirrored in other jurisdictions as well. In addition to that, we see growing disquiet and growing discomfort regarding the nature of transitional justice. So some years ago, we've had discussions about bottom-up approaches to TJ. We've had ongoing multidisciplinary approaches that criticize its empirical efficacy or empirical success. And recently and increasingly, we're seeing the use of the discourse of transformative justice to either supplement or critique transitional justice or to replace it altogether. And I've been interested in the last number of years in how those two trends intersect and interact. What does it mean to apply questions of transition or questions of transformation to a Western liberal democracy, an established democracy, because those democracies are often framed as being the desirable end goal in transitional justice. What does it mean to apply transition or transformation to a non-state actor, to a religious actor, churches or religious orders? And how do the claims for a theory of change that are inherent in transitional justice, that it contributes to civic trust, the rule of law, reconciliation, and so on, how do they apply to Western states and churches? And my thesis or my suggestion is that transition and transformation to be meaningful in addressing Western states and churches' roles in abuse must go beyond the current transitional justice institutional focus and look at structural injustice in both material and ideational terms, looking at both power and emotion. And I think it's important to frame this expansion or frame this reimagination of transitional justice as consistent with the history and use of the idea of transition. So Paige Arthur has a very famous and significant article looking at the role of transition in the development of the concept of transitional justice. And she also relies on an article by Gallen that looks at the contested nature of transition in the late 1980s and 1990s for those who were involved in early transitional justice initiatives. And Arthur and Gallen note that there's conscious choices made to focus the meaning of transition at a thin institutional level rather than at a social, political or economic level in those periods of time. And while that appropriate, and while that might have been efficacious in post-authoritarian societies, in a recent article, Pablo de Grief noted that by using that post-authoritarian conception of transition in post-conflict settings, most of the background conditions that gave rise to a plausible model of transition were absent in post-conflict contexts. And so transition has had to readjust or is in need of readjustment to deal with post-conflict settings that fall within its paradigm. And it's in that context then that I think transformative justice, that broader and more ambitious discourse regarding transitional justice, is seen as one of the alternative conceptions of transition from the very start. So if you look at early discussions involving Guillermo O'Donnell and others, there are debates about whether a more transformative approach to social change should be pursued in post-authoritarian settings. And so we have seen in the literature ongoing critique of the idea of transition within transitional justice. De Grief in that piece this year says the idea remains under-theorized and unresponsive to how the field has expanded. And so it's in that setting that the language and framing of transformative justice has emerged, often associated with the work of Paul Greedy and Simon Robbins, and their conception of transformation focuses on local agency and resources, focuses on process and how power intersects at global and local levels. And they note that transformative justice will exist beyond the current institutional focuses that preoccupy transitional justice. A very ambitious agenda that has been noted is very good at critique, but not very good at construction, and one that remains in its infancy. What I think is interesting about the transformative justice literature are the comments made on it a number of years ago by Pádraig MacAuliffe of Liverpool Law School, who suggests that the transformative justice approach believes that post-conflict and post-dictatorship societies are infinitely malleable, that if only we get the right ideas in the place and minds of the populace and of political leadership, then society can, quote, transform. He sees it, he says, one sees in the transformative transitional justice literature great optimism that the social worlds within states can be changed, and the main barriers to justice exist not in the context or state capacity or efficacy of transitional justice, but at the idea or cognitive level. And I believe that's also true in the potential for expanding transitional justice to Western consolidated democracies or churches. I believe there's a risk that transitional justice is understood as a panacea or a silver bullet that would transform or change public and state attitudes towards how to deal with the past. And I think that's naive, and I think that is to be avoided. As I mentioned in way of introduction, there's been a number of uses of transitional justice discourse in Western consolidated democracies. The one that Cheryl mentioned in my introduction focuses on the use of transitional justice to address mother and baby homes, announced by the then Minister for Children and Youth Affairs, Catherine Zappone, in 2017. Famously, we've also seen a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada addressing the use of residential schools for Indigenous children. And recently, we've seen transitional justice practices and Indigenous justice practices in the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls in Canada as well. We can see some mechanisms that are analogous to or akin to transitional justice processes in Australia, in the United Kingdom, and we can see some transitional justice language being used in non-state mechanisms, or proposals in the United States as well. And often the critique, or often the view here, is that these mechanisms apply by analogy or apply as an evaluative tool from a transitional justice perspective, but that there is in fact no broader political transition occurring within those countries, and we can return to that perhaps in the Q&A. What is common, I think, to those countries and to other states that are using transitional justice or transitional justice-like processes to deal with past historical abuses is there's a common set of wrongs that operate along a spectrum. The original focus of my research was on child sexual abuse, and child sexual abuse both in diocesan settings and within institutional settings. But if you look comparatively, you see that child sexual abuse exists in a context of broader institutional wrongdoing, and wrongdoing that is constitutive of a modern Western democracy. So we see abuse within the context of the widespread institutionalization of children, or of women who have breached society's moral codes, such as the mother and baby homes, immaculate laundries. We see those institutions as part of broader civilizational or assimilationist processes designed to create ideal type citizens and reflect emergent norms of nationalism for settler democracies or for post-colonial states such as the Republic of Ireland. And we see those institutions and assimilationist processes again in the context of broader colonial processes and broader, longer form historical injustices, such as the genocide of indigenous peoples, the theft and expropriation of land, and settler colonialism in itself. So there's a spectrum of wrongdoing, from individual acts of sexual abuse against children right up to bigger structural injustices over a number of decades or indeed centuries. But what is interesting is that if looked at in that longer term period of history, we see common justifications used and common rationalizations used for these different forms of historical wrong. We see the othering and scapegoating of the non-white male body as a threat to Western civilization, to Western morality, and to the Western legal order. We see this in the treatment of indigenous peoples and communities. We see this in the treatment of African Americans and slavery. And we see this in the treatment of the institutionalization of children as morally deviant, as capable of being the cause of moral corruption, and in the treatment of women and women's bodies in the laundries and mother and baby home contexts as well. And that othering and scapegoating is not inconsequential. Rather, it is co-constitutive with a Christian worldview within that historical context. So it's framed and sanctified and justified from biblical perspectives or papal perspectives, as the case might be, and aligns very strongly with social norms that develop outside of Christian justifications regarding patriarchy, empire, and the modern liberal individual. So those historical abuses then could be the subject of a paradigmatic approach from transitional justice. And this is where I've spent the last couple of years, I guess, in terms of my research, looking at the particular institutional responses to historical abuse through inquiries, accountability, redress mechanisms, and so on. And whether those mechanisms, as applied by Ireland or the US or UK or Canada or Australia, have anything to learn from mainstream transitional justice or deviate in any meaningful way. So our focus could be on institutional settings. And this will generate a number of what I would call retail level concerns. Are the inquiry models or redress models used in these states different in terms of how they produce or limit victim survivor trauma, how they produce historical narrative, truth narrative compared to a truth commission? Does the historical nature of the abuse, often the intergenerational nature of the abuse, mean that there would be limited capacity for accountability? And then there's design questions that would be familiar to those of you who've worked on reparations or analyzed reparations questions or apology questions in the past. What makes a good reparation scheme or apology scheme in these settings? And I thought that was enough to be going on, to be honest. But the more I looked at the literature in the area and the views of victim survivors in the area, the more I became concerned that these mechanisms were necessarily palliative in nature, and that these mechanisms were by design, if not by intention, going to leave broader intergenerational and historical experiences and ideas about historical abuse intact, that they were going to leave the othering of bodies, and they were going to leave the structure of Western societies, sovereignty and authority intact. And so they would respond to immediate need or political advocacy, but rather they wouldn't address root causes of historical abuse. And so my focus in the last 9 months or so has been to understand the relationship between transitional justice and structural injustices. And you can see a number of feminist legal theorists and political theorists mentioned here who've addressed the question of structural injustice. Iris Young's work has been developed by both Catherine Liu and Alasdair Nuti, who are concerned with the idea of distinguishing structural injustice from interactional injustice, as Catherine Liu puts it. And I put it to you that transitional justice is typically concerned with settling accounts of widespread or systemic interactional justice, that it looks at the relationship of individual citizens or citizens and the state, but leaves untouched questions of structural injustice, defined as the institutions, norms, practices, and conditions that played a causal or conditioning role in producing or reproducing objectionable social positions, conduct, and outcomes, etc. And I'm particularly of this view, aligning with Nuti's work, when it's looked at over a longer historical period of time, that structural injustice is not a modernist phenomenon, but is the product of intergenerational forms of interactional injustice and structural injustice compounding one another. And that by relegating them to history, we fail to see how longer term forms of injustice impact upon modern day injustices, and in our context, impact upon modern day transitional justice mechanisms. And I believe there's support for this idea of looking at structural injustice within mainstream transitional justice thinking. We often see discussions of the need for analysing the root causes of conflict or designing guarantees of non-recurrence to ensure that conflict never occurs again in the same fashion. But despite that rhetorical commitment, there's very little movement towards seeing more innovative, creative, or sophisticated forms of social transformation. And de Grief, in one of his special rapporteur reports, points, I think, to the cause of this. He says, the challenge of achieving justice is not merely a technical one. Lasting social transformation requires interventions not only at the institutional sphere, but also the cultural sphere and at the level of personal individual dispositions. While culture and character play a stabilizing role and are relatively immune to deliberate change, and so we can't expect to be pulling levers and changing culture in society, they are not immutable altogether. And I think it's in this space of limited potential, but unexplored and unexploited potential, that I want to focus on the potential role of transitional justice in Western consolidated democracies. Because my suggestion is, I think, to meaningfully address intergenerational historical forms of injustice in Ireland, the US or UK, for instance, it requires both specific institutional initiatives, so inquiries, redress, and so on, but also a re-understanding of what progress means and a re-understanding of a theory of change, a theory of transition for those societies. I believe the theory of change and the idea of progress related to transition has been radically neglected in transitional justice, particularly as the field remains liable to the criticism of being faith-based rather than fact-based. And so what I would like to propose is a useful starting point for looking at how social, cultural, and structural questions can be addressed through transitional justice, is to focus on two dimensions of that of structural injustice, to focus on power and to focus on the role of emotions. And I believe both of these have been neglected in TJ literature to date. What we see is that where power is implicated in transitional justice literature, it often can involve or often can necessitate a challenge to the authority of the state, and in the context of historical abuse, both the state and the church, or the church's source of authority, whether that be Bibles or popes and so on. And there seems to be limited discussion of the role of power within transitional justice and indeed within structural injustice literature. But if we look from critical theory at our understandings of power, we can see power being used as an equivalent or an analogy for forms of domination. But we can also see more optimistic conceptions of power that are more victim-survivor centered. The empowerment of survivors, a victim-centered approach, can align quite neatly with conceptions of power to or power with, or indeed power within. But the empirical question, I think, that we can ask of transitional justice institutions and of a broader process of transition that a country claims to engage in or does indeed engage in, is what is the role of power within those institutions? And in particular, is power only being contested ritually or transferred episodically? So are victim survivors only being empowered for as long as a truth commission is operating? Are they only being empowered to make decisions within specific institutional or material parameters? Are the broader structures of power or the broader dispositions of power in society between victim survivors and state institutions, and within state institutions, and victims and survivors and church institutions, are those broader structures of power changing or not? And I think that analysis of power would point TJ scholarship to look at the institutional practices, and look at the role of power within them, but would also require TJ to look at everyday experiences of power, who experiences power and powerlessness in everyday forms of justice or injustice, and how can we claim, to what extent can we claim, that those relate to historical structural injustices? So are the experiences of Indigenous people or of African Americans or of marginalized groups in Ireland or the United Kingdom, are they, and to what extent are they, related to historically structured forms of injustice or marginalization? And to what extent could institutional responses, TJ responses, bring that issue to bear and recommend or implement change as a result? So I think that's one dimension of structural injustice that TJ could very usefully focus on. The second one that I think warrants a significant examination is the role of emotion. And I'm quite taken with the work of Jonathan Heaney of Queen's, I believe, and his language of the emotional state, so the emotional vocabulary, the emotional framing for a political society or political community. Because often the focus of emotion in transitional justice has been on the emotional experience of survivors, and has been a rather pathologized understanding of how trauma shapes emotion and engagement with TJ institutions. And while I think obviously that remains critical and warrants much more empirical assessment than has been done to date, I'm interested in the way in which the language and vocabulary of emotion plays a role in the public narrative that politicians and religious leaders use to respond to historical abuse or respond to gross violations of human rights. Because my worry and my concern is that some of the language that's used and some of the emotional vocabulary that's used in transitional justice, and indeed in responding to historical abuse, may have the effect of perpetuating processes of othering, suggesting that by using certain emotional vocabulary or by othering perpetrators, we continue a process to scapegoat wrongdoers and to avoid the implication of collective responsibility or of social guilt. And I'm particularly interested in the role of the emotion of shame. Shame is used throughout a number of public apologies regarding historical abuse, and shame is used often regarding the experience of society, experience of perpetrators and victims regarding child sexual abuse especially. And I think shame is quite problematic, and again would happily discuss this in the questions, because it's state-based rather than conduct-based. Shame goes to the idea that you are a bad person rather than you have done a bad thing. And I think a partial or a selective understanding that there are bad people out there, and typically, of course, they happen not to be us, I think that continues a process of othering that is deeply problematic from a historical abuse perspective. So shame, emotions, and power, I think, are key forms of analysis then for TJ and TJ-like institutions in the historical abuse space. Because states focus on the use of inquiries, of limited accountability, and of redress and apologies in dealing with the abuse of church and state in a Western consolidated setting. And rather than focus merely on retail level questions or institutional design questions there, I think it might be more profitable to consider how those institutions and how those structures function as forms of power, and how they function as producers or as silencers regarding how emotions are understood individually first for victims and survivors, but also collectively at social and collective levels as well. And so I think there will be a number of sites that I would think are profitable to look at this, and they'll be quite familiar to anybody involved in TJ scholarship. And I think one area of potential creativity or potential growth will be to consider what a guarantee of non-recurrence looks like to address historical abuse in church and state. What does it mean to offer a guarantee that settler colonialism will not take place again, that intergenerational legacies of slavery or Jim Crow won't take place again, that the institutionalization of women and children won't take place again? I think those are much broader and ambitious questions, and I believe there's the potential for quite fertile growth there. I also believe it'll be important for TJ scholarship in the area to consider the application of questions of power and emotion to non-institutional settings and how they relate to the claimed goals and claimed values of transitional justice scholarship to move a society from a non-human rights compliant one to a different society, going to our question of change, but also to contribute to things like civic trust and the rule of law and reconciliation. And these are necessarily implicated in non-institutional contexts, and I think have to be examined there as well. So I think we've covered quite a lot of ground, and I hope it'll be the basis for fertile discussion. I've a number of parts of this that are less developed than I would like, and I would really welcome the views of and questions of this group with such expertise and such interest. But to conclude, what I would suggest is that if transitional justice is to play a meaningful role in the likes of Ireland or the US or Australia, it cannot merely perform institutional forms of justice. Because if it does so, it will run the risk of legitimating structures of power and emotional narratives that may continue to marginalize victim survivors and groups that have been historically abused for multiple generations. So as a result, I think if we're going to talk about transitional justice in a Western consolidated democracy or in a church, an institutional church setting, we necessarily have to problematize and necessarily have to challenge the concepts and processes of authority and of sovereignty that are involved in those democracies and in those churches. And our focus for evaluation, our focus for inquiry, I believe, has to be on the process by which transitional justice is pursued. Because I believe the nature of transition or the nature of transformation for these societies or these churches will be much more subtle, much more ideational and material, but will be less perhaps clear or less linear than a transition from conflict to peace or dictatorship to democracy, or at least as those transitions claim to be in the literature. Because in particular, and I think it's worth reflecting on this, I believe there's something necessarily tragic in attempting to do transitional justice to respond to intergenerational forms of abuse or historical forms of abuse, because there are lives that cannot be changed. There are legacies and histories that cannot be brought back. Justice will necessarily be imperfect or indeed very imperfect, and what's lost cannot be remade. And I think looking at both power and emotion, it would be very easy for us to presume a certain type of transitional justice can make everything well. It would be very comforting, perhaps. But instead, I think the appropriate set of emotions to our posture to consider with this work is that perhaps there will inevitably be limitation, failure, and that needs to be embraced and lamented. And I believe, again, we can draw strength or draw recognition of the fact that this is true in paradigmatic transitional justice as well. I'm very taken with the mission statement of the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, the reparation scheme arising out of the Holocaust, which says we know the horrors of the Holocaust can never be repaired and must never be forgotten. And I think it's in that tension that I hope there is the potential for a critically informed and imaginative understanding of how transitional justice can apply to Western liberal democracies and to Christian churches. So I'm going to stop the share now, I think. Yes. And I look forward to any discussion or any questions we might have. Thanks very much for your attention.
James, that was absolutely fascinating as always. And I am quite in awe of how you managed to cover quite so much ground in 35 minutes. It's extremely impressive. I'd now like to open the floor to conversation if you either want to raise your hand or to use the chat bar. Perhaps while you formulate your own questions, I can abuse my position as chair of today's proceedings. And James, as you know, I'm interested in the idea of emotions, and I think that idea of victims or perpetrators being shamed, and that like notion of shame as being like a state-based version of shame, in the sense that you're a bad person, not the idea that you are a person who has also done a bad thing, is inherently problematic, and it really points to an individualization of blame and shame. And I wondered, when you were thinking about how to frame this in a transitional justice context and in the sense of dealing with the past and whatever that looks like, had you given any thought to how a transitional justice framework to historical abuse could perhaps make use of Braithwaite's work on reintegrative shaming as a way to try to challenge or ameliorate some of those dynamics around blame and shame?
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm really interested in the potential for reintegrative shaming. And I think the subtlety of that as a practice or as a sort of distinction is often lost in the public way in which shame is discussed in historical abuse contexts. And I think where I see the potential is to have a sort of a both and understanding of how shame can be understood, which is to think about it may have potential at an individual interactional level for individual perpetrators, particularly as regards child sexual abuse, where we're looking to reimagine understandings of self and understandings of wrongdoing from a perpetrator perspective. And I know Anne-Marie's written on this, and I know colleagues in UCD have as well, where I would be very reluctant to see that type of language sort of anthropomorphized is at the political level, to suggest that society could be reintegratively shamed into addressing historical abuse and wrongdoing. Because that's effectively what we saw with the Magdalene Laundrie's apology. And Clara Fisher has written on this, that Ireland was ashamed of not only what was done, but the fact we had done nothing about it. And so the way to overcome our shame was to do something about it. But of course, what was done then was highly imperfect and caused retail level shame to individuals. So I think it may have a very important role to play individually. I'd be very reluctant to see it at that emotional state or that political discourse level. Perfect.
Thanks, Jim. We have a comment from Claire in our chat bar here, who's one of our students. Claire, I'm going to bring you in a second because I also see Anne-Marie has her hand up. I think this might be a natural point for Anne-Marie to come in at.
Thanks, Cheryl. Just may I, James, just a quick comment first and then a question. So first of all, thank you very much for a really interesting, excellent presentation. I think, first of all, a couple of very important points that you make in your analysis that really aren't really developed very well in the literature, which I think you're really filling a real, very important gap here. And there are two of them, as I say. One is, I think, the understanding that child sexual abuse has to be understood in a much broader context than just the actual sexual abuse. So it's not just the sexual aspect, it's the emotional, physical abuse, neglect. It's the whole transgenerational trauma, denied basic human rights, lack of education that has knock-on effects for them and their families. That's really important to acknowledge that. So thank you for that. I actually was going to ask you about the reintegrative shaming bit that Cheryl picked up on. So thank you for stealing my question, Cheryl. But I'll phrase it a wee bit differently. I'm actually working on a piece at the minute on apologies on shame, as I mentioned to you before, James, and it's based on interviews with victims and survivors as well as apologisers. Now, it's very interesting to say, it's probably more a question or a throwing a comment back at you, that you don't think it can be used at the societal level. It has more or less confined to the interpersonal level, because I'm trying to develop my thinking on this, and I think it has been used badly, I think, in the societal context, where it's been used in the context of, say, Enda Kenny's second apology for the Magnan laundries. It wasn't done very well, and it was used in a rhetorical sense. But I don't know if I agree with the fact that it can't be used at all in a more macro level societal context. I think it has the most impact if it's done at an interpersonal level, in terms of that dialogue and dealing with the emotion and the shame between the perpetrator and the victim. But I think, I would like to think anyway, it has resonance potentially if done right at a more societal level through sort of national reconciliation processes. I don't know whether you have any further thoughts back on that.
I think that's an important sort of clarification in terms of its conceptual use. As I say, Kenny's is probably a really bad example of how it's used. I think my concern kind of emanates from the idea that if we go back and look at sort of the context of institutionalization or context of abuse, or in the context of sort of colonial engagement, shame plays a significant role in the world creation or the norm creation of othering that's involved for the historical abuses in the first place. And so whether it's a colonial power or a church or an institution, they're using shame to justify and to frame the what they're doing, and then to create an environment or conditions in which individual acts of human rights abuse can take place. And I'm really worried with the idea that as a society, we structurally continue a process of saying it's okay to shame some group, to perpetuate the idea that it's some group's fault that wrongdoings have taken place, and that therefore we as society, because we did nothing, bear responsibility for this. I think that's misguided, because I think it continues at a very subtle level. I think it continues the process of scapegoating, which is, let's just run the paedophiles out of the village and then everything will be fine. We as society will remain innocent and will remain blameless. And I think the language of guilt is harder for a society to face up to, but thinking about guilt analytically at individual, institutional, collective, and social levels is probably more profitable, because you can say, look, we are guilty of something, but so are all of these other actors. And I think it is an easier journey from guilt to responsibility than it is from shame, because I think shame, because of its emotional impact or resonance that you mentioned, I think it creates incentives for society to push away the problem, as opposed to recognizing its constitutive of our individual and national or religious identity, as it might be, and that responsibility is normal. It's not aboriginal. It's not exceptional. All societies since the beginning have screwed up. All churches since the beginning have made mistakes. That's not a weird thing. That's an existence condition for who we are. So we shouldn't be shaming ourselves for it. We should be saying we are responsible for making mistakes, and we're going to make them in the future. And we need to get behind that, as opposed to, we're normally really, really wonderful national people or religious people, but we had this horrible thing that we're embarrassed and can't talk about, so let's do something to go away. I think the focus on guilt has different incentives, and I guess that's why I'd favour it. None of that's empirical. That's just my gut, and I think it warrants a lot more scrutiny.
That's very helpful. Thank you, James.
My pleasure.
Thanks very much, James. We have a question here in the chat bar from Claire. Claire is one of our master's students, so welcome, Claire, and thank you for joining us today. And Claire is wondering about the background to your research. In particular, did you do any empirical work with victims and survivors? And maybe if you could just explain to Claire and the rest of us the nature of your work, James.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks very much. I haven't conducted primary research with victims and survivors in Ireland, and my motivation with that has been that I don't think I've got interesting enough questions to bother people with who I'm aware have a variety of experiences of researchers and of trauma and of engagement with the state. I have been involved with victim survivor representative organisations and individuals from an advocacy perspective. And I also think, again, there's a sort of a timing component to when I would engage with primary research in that setting. That being said, the work is based on amplifying pre-existing accounts of victim survivor voices wherever possible, because it would be really perverse if I was just superimposing a narrative on them. So in the Irish context, I've drawn, for instance, on the Clan report conducted by Mabel O'Rourke and others that gathers the voices of survivors of mother and baby homes. I've looked at the Reclaiming Self report, which is in the Residential Institution Redress Board context. And I could point you to others for different institutional settings. I think there's a bigger question here, a bigger gap here about how those voices are amplified, particularly in Ireland or in other historical abuse contexts. There's also, as is in any TJ setting, there's a politics of victimhood. And I think the voices that are amplified or the voices that are researched have to be assessed, excuse me, in terms of their representativeness and in terms of their sample size and so on as well. So for all of those reasons, I wanted to understand first what I thought I was going to ask people, which hopefully has been made clear in the first half hour is quite complicated, before I would engage people with those questions. So it's on my agenda, but it's not something I've done to date, unfortunately.
Super, thanks. So we have another question here from Fiona, who's in the School of History, Anthropology, Politics and Philosophy. So you can obviously read for yourself, but Fiona's question is very timely, and she's relating to the question about kind of effectively locking away people's records, or those records in relation to the mother and baby homes. And she's picked up on Maria Enright's suggestion that something like a Stasi-like archive should be created. What's your perspective on that, James?
Thanks for the question. Very, very timely indeed. As that controversy was going on, I was very drawn to the kind of the Derrida quote that's often used: "Whoever controls the archive controls the power," which links into my kind of a counter analysis. I agree very, very closely with Mairead. We're working together with a number of other advocates and activists to develop the Irish Stasi archive, or that type of model legislation, and our hope will be to engage in a process of public consultation with survivors and with government and other actors on that. I think, given the concerns survivors have about process in these commissions, and the concerns survivors have about access to their own information, a firm and open archival basis for these different institutions will have to be critical, because there's a real compartmentalization and siloing of survivors' experiences and survivors of different institutions that really misrepresents the Irish historical abuse. They're not just different institutional settings, they were interconnected. People went from laundries to mother and baby homes, were abused in dioceses and gave up their kids for adoption, and so on and so on. So we need to look at the thing in the whole, and we also need to look at the processes in the whole. So Ireland's been addressing these questions for about 20 years, and we don't really know whether they work or not from a survivor perspective, or whether they were re-traumatizing or not, holistically from a survivor perspective. And from an archivist perspective, it's been made very, very difficult to prove or to satisfy oneself as to the comprehensive nature of the public inquiries. So to be able to say, I'm going to check, or I'm going to examine or audit or evaluate the work of the Ryan Commission or the McAleese Commission or the current commission, that's been really, really difficult because of the archival practices. And it was it was last year when the government's proposal was to seal the records related to the Ryan Commission and the Redress Board scheme for 75 years. So the current controversy around the Mother and Baby Home scheme was a 30-year seal. Previous effort was for that as well. And the McAleese records have been held by the Department of the Taoiseach, quote, for safekeeping, not for the purposes of the National Archives Act or the Freedom of Information Act, end quote. And in January of this year, that was held to be contrary to law by the Information Commissioner. So there's been a number of times where the state has just said, you're not getting access to your information. And I think there's something really significant about that in terms of how it reveals the state's attitude towards power and whether power has changed in any sort of structural way for survivors, and the state's attitude towards information and towards truth. Because transitional justice is often sort of flippant to say, oh yeah, there's loads of versions of truth, isn't there? There's like the Truth Commission truth and the societal truth, and many horses for courses. The Irish approach seems to suggest there is the one God-given truth, and it is the truth of these reports. And your capacity as survivors to construct your own truth, to annotate your own records, any of those sort of components that we might expect, that's really been shut down. And so I think that's a really significant indicator that power is being consolidated as the state investigates the past. And I think that is deeply problematic. And there will be movement on the archives soon. The government's announcement after it passed the bill was to commit to a national archive that would house the institutional records across these different inquiries. And there's ongoing discussions about creating a national archive for historical abuse records on Sean McDermott Street in Dublin, which is the site of the last Magdalen laundry owned by the state. It's in the hands of Dublin City Council. So I'm very hopeful that will be supported and resourced. And as I said, please watch this space for model legislation that will hopefully be coming down the tracks.
Super, thanks, James. And I think that notion of one truth and who controls the idea of like a consolidation of the power as a way to control the past as the state investigates its own past is an extremely telling comment. We have a question here from Paula Shilliday. Paula is one of our PhD students, and you may know each other, but there's a very natural overlap, a point of connection between your research and Paula's work. And Paula's posing the question there about whether memorialization has the potential to address church and state responsibility in a way that's transformative and engages with emotion and encourages people to think about their part in abuse.
Thanks for the question, Paula. It's good to see you. I completely agree as a matter of principle that memorialization has a huge role to play within this context. I am wary of the risk of mere memorialization being seen as sufficient or being seen as having a necessarily transformative effect. So sort of like McAuliffe's critique that just because we said it's transitional or that it's memorialization means that it's doing that work. And I'm conscious of that because that was one of the options that was proposed by government regarding the site in Tuam, which still remains unexcavated and the remains remain unidentified. So they proposed 5 options like about 2 years ago now. And the first was just memorialization. We will put up a plaque on the site in Tuam. And I don't know what they thought was going to be the response to that. But it's pretty quick within the thinking around memorialization that you have to acknowledge something. Right? You have to acknowledge something that's taken place. You have to categorize or characterize something. And it was deeply unclear to me what the government thought they would be acknowledging or what they would be memorializing. Here lie here lie, quoting the minister, a substantial amount of human remains, end quote, because what else could they say? They can't currently say there's 796 little children there because they don't know. They can't say what the causes of death were. They can't say what the state responsibility or wrongdoing was yet because the commission hasn't reported and we haven't excavated the site. So I am wary of the risk of sort of a mere placard approach to memorialization. There's a rock and roll trail around Dublin where you can go and see Bono bust to this spot and Bob Geldof bust to this spot and all the rest. I'm wary of that sort of version of memorialization in Ireland. I'm very excited about the potential, however, for a more meaningful process of memorialization to have that catalytic effect and that participatory effect for both survivors, but also for wider society. Because one of the things I've been doing is trying to map Irish institutions geographically and map them over time. And then hopefully if we have a broader, a more robust archival infrastructure, we could kind of map individuals within those institutional settings. And what I'm interested in that is because these things were everywhere. And they were predominant features and significant features of life in rural Ireland, and they were predominant features of church life and life within religious institutions. And in terms of memorialization, I think it has the potential to go back to Anne-Marie's question, excuse me, of saying, can we do this in a way that speaks to collective political narrative and implicates social responsibility or implicates social guilt or shame in a constructive way? It says we are memorializing something that occurred here, not despite our knowledge, but with our knowledge, or with our acquiescence, or with our complicity, or with our fear, to use emotional language, or with our concern. And to think about ways in which there are modern day analogies of that Ireland should be looking to root out, and modern day analogies of that Ireland should be looking to radically change. I think it's an unfortunate, well, it's ironic whether it's fortunate or not. The current Minister for Children and Youth Affairs, who has responsibility for Tuam, also has responsibility for ending Ireland's system of direct provision, our system of institutional confinement of asylum seekers. And I think there's a comparison to be made there about what we're memorializing and what we're doing today, that could hopefully be changed. So yeah, huge potential, but I guess I'm not optimistic.
And on that slightly pessimistic note, I should say that we are out of time this afternoon, and I wanted to give my thanks to all of you for giving up an hour of your already busy agendas for attending, but most importantly for James, who has not only given his time to give this seminar today and has covered a huge amount of ground, but also is doing genuinely original academic work, but also work that is of huge social importance. And I think bringing emotions into the fold in that is absolutely crucial. So to thank you and to commend you, James, it was fascinating and a pleasure as always. If anyone does have any further questions or anything I can direct you to in terms of some of James's publications or anything you'd like to follow up on, please do get in touch. I know for some of our human rights students, there is an opportunity to have some further conversation with classmates after this seminar. So I'm sure some of you will continue the conversation there. But if I can speak for all of us, if I can, I'm sure you have given us an absolute ton to think about today, James. So thank you once again.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
No bother. Speak to you soon.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.